Catherine Hoke and
Joanna
Bell. This
Miller.
is on. Yes. Turn it off for a minute till we get this settled straight. He had his father married again when his mother died, and Benjamin and Bill were an Ambrose. Now Ambrose Brand fought in the Civil War, and I have his history too. And Catherine Hook. This is all my dad's, the Lichty side, my mother's side here. Clarabelle. This is Catherine Hook. And Joan Ayres. John Lichty was her father, and Jacob Lichty was his father. Here, you can understand it, I'm sure.
Nevada and Missouri. Those were names of kids.
Yes. That's not. That was where do you see Nevada?
Over here.
Oh yes. Okay. That would be John Lichty, isn't that right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
John Lichty's kids.
Right. That's his brothers and sisters, and here's his kids right here.
Mm-hmm.
My mother was Marie Louise.
Okay.
I'm trying to get this before we start so we know where we're at, you know. Okay. Stevens, Henry J. Lentz. Just hold this a minute. Henry J. Lentz, that's Henry. Now the donors, this is what I'm trying to figure out. I didn't know about this. I knew who they are, but I didn't know on which side they were on. Mary, Minnie, and Kate Lachlan were married. That would be your great-great-great-grandfather. Your four-great-grandfather, yes. And he fought in the Civil War, and she was only 16 when he married her. She was raised by two older people, and they had two children. And then next you have Jenny Green and Benjamin Brown. That's these two. And they had 4 children. And she died when the boys were real young. They weren't even school age yet. And he farmed and worked in the mine. Then he remarried a woman, I forget her name now, but it's here on the, and they had several children. Then my dad married my mother, Marie Louise Lichty, and they had 7 children altogether. They're right here. We lived out on a farm. I was born in a log house up in Lichty Hollow, they called it. It run from Ruffsdale to the Scottdale-Smithton Road, several miles. That was all Lichty Hollow. And my dad worked in the mill and he farmed too. So anyway, when I was little, he did the house all over and built onto the house and built a new barn and a new chicken house, new spring house, new pig pen, and we also built a garage. And it was the first Model T Ford, and I can remember it real well. I was about 5. And I thought it was wonderful. I lay down in the back seat, and I was always a little devil. I got into all kinds of trouble. Anyway, one time we were going to Ruffsdale, and they had those big rubber thin wheels, and it was real deep, the mud ruts in the road, and I had a nickel in my mouth. We were going to a picnic, and I swallowed the nickel. They were so upset about it.
Why did you have a nickel in your mouth?
Well, my dad gave me a nickel, you know, and of course I put it in my mouth, and they had to rush me to the doctor. They're scared to death. I was always getting in trouble. Anyway, we went then on to the church picnic. The doctor said, "Oh, don't worry about it. She'll be all right." Then I go to the church picnic, and my mother said, "Now, Leisure, you watch her. You know how she is." I got up. They had me all dressed up in a pretty little white, real fine dress with a little pink rosette on, you know, and the shoes and fancy stockings and everything. And I was jumping, running on the picnic tables, jumping from one to another. And I fell and I hit my head and I was bleeding away, and everybody was so excited about me. I wasn't a bit worried about it. They had to take me back to the doctor and have me stitched up. But anyway, the place was beautiful. My dad always kept it. It was like a park. And Donald and Jean were my brothers and sisters, you know, the older ones. And I was the youngest one. Of course, they were supposed to watch me. And we had a lot of fun there. We had an old pig that was about 500 pounds, and she was a pet. And we were going to butcher her, but we didn't the first year till the next year. So my mother and I, Grandma's was about, not even a quarter of a mile away. But anyway, we went over to Grandma's one day, and we came back, and they had built a new summer kitchen on. And my dad had bought a new oil stove, so it was nice to cook, you know, in the summer kitchen, cool. And here that old pig got up on the front porch, went up 2 steps, rooted its way into the summer kitchen, and she had coal all over. She had, everything was new in it. She had everything in a horrible shape. My mother cried. I'll never forget it. It was awful. And we finally got it all cleaned up, but after that we killed the pig.
Did it taste better for it?
But anyway, we used to have, when we'd go to church on Sunday, we went up to Zion Church. We'll show you that. And half of the church would come home with us. My mother would work all day Friday and Saturday cooking and baking, and we'd make homemade ice cream when they come, you know, on Sunday morning after church. Well, usually it was in the afternoon. They would come to our place. Then that was the social life you had, you know, the church. And of course, everybody liked to come to our place because Mom made the homemade noodles and always killed the chickens and had everything for Sunday. And the preacher used to come, and I hated his son. He was a little rascal, you know. He was one of those that teased you. I was about 4 at the time, and I imagine he was about 6. But he got to sit in the dining room with his dad and mother and all the company, and Donald and Jean and I sit in the kitchen because there wasn't enough room for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And he got the drumsticks, and we had to eat the wings. Of course, you always gave the company the best, you know. And anyway, I was so mad one time. The preacher had his hat upside down on the chair in the hallway of the living room, you know, before he went into the living room. They were in the dining room. It was all open. My mother had it all done over, and it was really pretty. But anyway, I got the gravy that was left off of the stove, the pan of gravy, and Donald and Jean weren't watching me too close. So I took the gravy and poured it in the preacher's hat. Boy, did I get fanned. But they had to buy him a new hat. And my mother said, now, why weren't you watching her? But anyway, Donald and Jean always got in trouble over me. But we had a wonderful life. We really did.
Were you the youngest?
Yes, at the time. Then there were 5.5 years later, there was Betty and May and Jim and Fern, you know, came. It was almost like 2 families. But anyway, we did. And then we moved to Roughdale after several years.
In Leakey Hollow, you lived in a log cabin?
We lived in Leakey, yeah, but my dad had everything fixed up after.
Did you have indoor plumbing and
power?
No,
not then. No, you didn't have indoor plumbing. No, that was we had a heater. That was the big thing, you know.
What kind of a heater? Oil or?
No, a coal heater. But my mother was way ahead of her time. She had bookcases built in the dining room, you know, and everything real fancy. Everything plastered. Every place she went, she tore everything out of the house and did everything over.
So did she have to cook on a wood stove?
Oh, yeah, we had a nice coal stove. But we had a coal stove till I was married at home.
What about electricity?
We had electricity,
Telephone?
But, no, we didn't have a phone then. We had later. But not up in the Leakey Hollow. No, that was everybody. All the Leakeys lived in Leakey Hollow, and they were wealthy farmers. You know, there was 2 brothers. One-armed John, they thrashed, and one-armed John had his arm taken off. And there were 2 brothers, and really 3 brothers to begin with, and 2 sisters, and they lived together all those years and never married. I'll show you their tombstones when we go out to Zion. But anyway, and they were so frugal. They would make dresses out of gunny sacks. And they were wealthy people. And when they died, they got the very best casket you could buy, and they would have a blanket of flowers over their casket. Now, that didn't do much good.
No, it seems a little backwards, doesn't
And
it?
yes, and these gorgeous tombstones, you know, a big tombstone with all the little ones around.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, and they were, like I say, farmers, but we used to walk to Rustdale, Jean and I, down to the store, and we'd always stop for a drink of water at their place. And they would give you water, but they'd never offer you a cookie or anything, like my mother always had cookies and everything for the kids, you know. Then we'd stop down at Moore's. That was on down far. There was about
These
200.
were your, like, uncles and aunts? Then?
Yeah, they were relatives, you know, distant relatives.
Oh.
But anyway, I would run off to my grandma's an awful lot. She was a widow then, you know. And she lived on the farm, Alice Lichty. There's the farm. Oh, I love my grandma. This was her house, and she had a garden right here, and this was the barn, and there's always kittens.
Hold on, wait a minute.
There was always...
Nope.
Grandpap Lichty worked at they call it the pump house, you know. They pumped air into the mines. And they were well off, too.
Coal mines?
Yes, the coal mines. But he was the main man at the pump house. I don't know what you call him. And that was between our place where I was born, the log house, and her farm over here, you know. In between was the pump house. And I would run off. I would run off and go to Grandma's all the time. And my mother would get so provoked at me, and she'd bring a switch, and she'd switch my legs for... I was only about 3.5 at the time when I started. But if she'd be in the spring house or chicken house, I'd go to Grandma's quick. And one time, it was cold winter day, and the snow was deep, and I run over in my nightgown, barefooted, with a little hat that you tied up. She always made our nightgowns and made our hats to match because it was cold in the bedrooms, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all I had on it. Oh, my mother was so mad at me, and Grandma was mad at Mom for giving me a switching. But I got home all right. But anyway, I loved my grandma, and I'd run off every chance I got to go with her. And we used to work in the garden together. And she had an outside toilet, of course, and she always wore an apron. And she smoked a corncob pipe. And she didn't want me to know it, and of course I knew all about it. Kids know immediately. And she would put her pipe in her pocket and go to the toilet, and she'd smoke. And the smoke would be coming out the little moon, you know, that was cut in the toilet door. But I would sit there and I wouldn't let on know how that I knew she was smoking. But when she had little peepees, she'd bring put the corn in the oven and toast it, you know. And then we'd grind it in the coffee grinder. I have the coffee grinder down on the in the cellar on the mantle. And we'd grind it, and I would sit above her on the steps. She had a kitchen that went up into the living room and parlor upstairs. There was 2 parlors, the everyday parlor and the good one, you know. But anyway, she'd say, Dorsey Dilk, fine as silk. She'd sing, and I'd sing, Granny Grunt, fine as punk. And I was only like 3 and 4 then, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I dearly loved my grandma. She was a wonderful.
Here's the coffee.
Yeah, this is the... Yes, we'd put the corn in here and turn it, and then it would come in here real fine. And that's how we would feed our peepees. The old cook and the peepees.
What are peepees?
Peepees are little baby chicks, you know.
Okay.
And the old cooks would lay their eggs out in the field somewhere and hatch the peepees out. They'd have maybe 25 peepees, you know, at one time. And then they'd go to the barn. She'd put them in the barn. But she had cows and horses and things. And she had a nice spring house that we did too at home, that we kept her milk and everything. But then we moved to Rustdale. She died then. Well, she didn't die until long.
So where was the farm?
This was up in Lichty Hollow. This was in Lichty Hollow. There's a lot of Lichtys lived in Lichty Hollow, you know.
So that's the house and the barn?
That's the house and the barn, and spring house is down in here, and the garden was over here. She had a beautiful garden.
What's there now?
Now, this is Alice Liechty. I don't know. I haven't been up there for years. The barn was burned. Somebody burned it. But this was Alice and John Liechty's farm here. Restdale and Alverton. This is Restdale, and this is Alverton. It would be right on this side of Restdale. It should go up in this way would be Liechty Hollow.
Hold on.
That's it, right through there. And it's, you go up in there about 2 or 3 miles, you know. That's all Liechty Hollow.
And where is it from Roughdale?
Between Restdale and Alverton. You go out just a short distance from Restdale, and you turn to your right. Go down a little hill, and then it's up through there that's called Liechty Hollow. There's a mine up in there, and it's all farming country, you know. But then up clear on the end is where my grandmother lived. Then we turned to your right and went over farther, and that's where our farm was. They sold it, and he worked in the mill. And we lived in Restdale for a while, and I went to school there for the first year in Restdale, and Jean went there, and Donald had graduated then from there. But Donald wouldn't go to high school. They bought him everything he wanted, a new bicycle, new clothes, and he got in with a crowd from Restdale, the Whitesels and the Scotts. They were all real intelligent people and came from intelligent parents, but he refused. We thought he was going to school, and he was playing hooky, working over in Cutter's garage. Oh, that was awful. And my mother was so mad she gave him an awful licking. Jean and I stood on the living room, stood up on the davenport and screamed and bawled our heads off so the neighbors would hear. And we got a licking too for bawling. But he never would go to high school. And Donald was a real intelligent man. It was a shame. But he ended up being a supervisor down at Christie Park. And they wanted him to run a big factory down in town. He was a real intelligent person and never even had a high school education. And he was really something, I'll tell you. But he did real well in life. And then his family was Dwayne and Sally and Ed and Pete. He married Rhodey, and they lived in Restdale. And he worked at Christie Park, but he worked himself right up to the top. You know, everybody thought a lot of him.
Did your other brothers and sisters finish high school?
Oh, yeah, everybody did but Donald. Listen, it was during the Depression, and things were pretty rough at home. But boy, that was no excuse. I had one dress my senior year, and I'd wash it out at night. Because everybody was in the same boat. You didn't know how bad it was until you went through it, you know, the Depression.
Well, can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, that's a sad part, I'll tell you. You know, my dad had a heart attack, and this was when Jim and Fern was the baby. There was Donald and Jean and I, and then Betty and May and Jimmy and Fern. And they were younger, but they went to school too. We'd go on the bus then. We were the first one on the bus and the last ones off, and it took about 2 hours to get home and go there in the morning. The buses didn't have heat in then, and I was always in the very back row, back at the bus door, you know. But anyway, Jim went to grade school, and so did Patricia and May, and Betty too then. But it was rough at home. We had, you know, things to eat because we worked on the farm, but things got real rough even then after several years.
So were you still on the farm?
No, we were at on the farm on the upper end of Liechty Hollow then, up near the Alverton Smithton Road. That was the very end of it. But we had our own vegetables and things that we would.
Was it a problem buying coal to heat in the winter?
No, he would get down, and my dad would get down and dig the coal out of the mine, the old mine down by Grandma's. And we had a spring house that we kept our apples in. And he would bury the potatoes in the garden. You know, you made a mound, and you'd maybe put 50 bushel of potatoes in there. Put straw, build it up, you know. And put dirt on top, so the water would run off. And you'd leave a hole into it. And one side would put our parsnips and carrots and things, on the one side, and then the other side, the cabbage and things. You could reach in there and get did it taste good in the winter. And we had our own meat. We had a smokehouse. We'd smoke our meat and hang it up, with apple wood. Hang it on the sausage we'd put in casing and wrap it around on these, like broomsticks, and hang it up so the smoke would go through.
What was the meat? Beef?
No, pork. Usually pork. Everybody had pork. And the hams and the shoulders, And we'd make our own apple butter. We had an apple orchard and a plum orchard. And we had 50-gallon copper kettle. And all the neighbors would come in when we would make our apple butter and help us peel apples and snip them,
And snip them?
Snip them. That's when you took the seeds out, and sliced them. But anyway, there were 5 of us girls, and we were older. And we always helped the neighbors, too. We were never allowed to take any money. You always helped your neighbor. And we would all go, and of course they left to see 5 girls and Mom come. That was big help. Nobody had that many girls in the family. And they were always anxious to see us. So anyway, they'd come and help us, but we would boil our cider down. My dad would take the apples out to Regentown, to the cider press, and he would make barrels of cider, And he'd always keep 1 barrel for vinegar every winter. He'd put the mother in the old barrel to the new barrel.
The mother?
The mother, that's the, when you leave cider go to vinegar, it's a mass that forms, and they call that the mother. And then if you put it in the new barrel, it gets sour quicker. It makes vinegar much quicker. So we always used an awful lot of vinegar. But anyway...
for cleaning or cooking?
Oh, everything. You use vinegar for everything. Anyway, yeah, you put it I think I put vinegar on you one time. You were up at the cabin.
Foot, I think.
Yes, and you said it stung and you cried. I said, well, it's used like an antiseptic, Oh, yeah, vinegar is good for everything, like soda. We never used toothpaste at home. We always used soda. And when your dad went to dental school, I told him, he said, Mom, you better wait and let me see if you're allowed to use soda, if it would do any injury to the teeth, the enamel of the teeth. And I said, Henry, all my life, and I still do. It's cleaner than it keeps your teeth a lot cleaner.
Baking soda?
Baking soda. We always had 1 box that would just put your toothbrush in the baking soda. I do that today. I keep 1. I don't use it for anything else. But it really cleans your teeth. Anyway, we'd make our apple butter, and you had to stir it forever, You had wood. We had a great big long stirrer. I still have one. Yes, and the fire. Well, you have to be away from the fire, It's about that long on the edge of a handle stick, or bigger than a stick. But anyway, that's what you stirred it with, so it wouldn't.
So how did you make apple butter?
You have to boil your apples with your boiled down cider and your spices. You put them in, and that's your apple butter.
How long does it take?
Oh, hours. It takes hours, but we never put it in jars. Get some of that out of there. We'll have it for lunch. Henry dearly loves it. Anyway, if you don't put much sugar in it because your boiled down cider is real sweet. You use 4 kinds of apples to make good apple butter. And you use a sour apple, a tart apple that's not quite as sour, and then 2 sweet apples. And it takes about 5 or 6 hours to make a 50-gallon copper kettle of apple butter. Now, when you say 50-gallon, it's not filled clear up to the top, you understand. It has to boil down, though. And
you start with 50 gallons? Or?
Not clear. It's a 50-gallon kettle. You probably start with maybe 25-gallon or 30, till you have your apples and it boils down. But you have to stir that all that time.
So how much do you get when you're done?
Oh, you might get 20-gallon. But we never put it in jars. We put it in 2-gallon crocks and gallon crocks. And then we'd put paraffin on top, melt it and put it on top of that when the apple butter cooled. And then my mother, then you bought sugar by 25-pound bags, and they had muslin in them. You know, they were muslin bags. And she'd wash them and have them nice and clean. We'd tie it around so nothing could get to it, and store it back in the back cellar at home, where we hung our meat for the winter to keep it cool, you know. And we had a plum orchard, and we'd make plum butter too. You didn't use boiled down cider, though. You used sugar and other things for plum butter. Peach butter the same way, but you always made it out in the copper kettle outside. The same with baked beans. We'd cook our beans, you know, and make baked beans outside too. Put bacon in them and sugar and different spices, you know, and fix
So
them.
that would keep a while too.
Oh yes, all those things. We canned our beef and pork and chicken, you know, all those kind of things.
What animals did you have on the farm?
Oh, we had horses and cows, and
working horses.
Mm-hmm, 2 working horses, and we'd raise calves, you know, and kill them for food.
So I'm guessing you didn't have a tractor.
Oh yeah, we had a tractor,
Okay.
but later on, I'll tell you that story too. That's when we were later. But when we moved from Rossdale up to the farm, we had a real nice spring house, and you kept your milk, you know, in crocks. In the spring, some places was deeper than others. Some deep enough for a 3-gallon can, or a crock that was a gallon crock, and then maybe a little deeper than that. Then ran out. The water would run out into a bathtub. We had a big bathtub for a watering trough, and I had water lilies in there and goldfish. And those goldfish got this big, and they would spawn and lay their eggs. Now,
wait a minute, how big?
They were big like this. Oh, they'd be 1.5 feet long. They were huge, but they'd stay in there all winter. And they would spawn and lay their eggs among the water lilies. And we never fed them or anything. They got enough food out of that, you know, and the things that fell in from the trees and they blew in. And it always had a lot of little fish in there. People couldn't believe it. But it was so interesting. All these they'd lay their eggs when they spawned, you know, among the water lilies and the roots of them. And it was all good fresh water from the spring house. But people couldn't believe how big those fish were. And the horses and cattle would drink out of the watering trough, you know. But oh, it was interesting. We always had pigs, and it was really nice, you know. It was a life that I'd never have missed. I'd never want to miss.
This was all during the Depression?
Yes, Well, we moved then.
Well, what during the Depression? So what were the hardships?
Oh, Lord.
You didn't have enough money for clothes?
We didn't. My feet were out in the ground one whole winter, and I wouldn't even tell my dad and mother.
Oh, you wore for your shoes?
Yes, sir. And I wasn't the only one. Everybody was in the same boat. The boys would come. You didn't have blue jeans then, you know. They had pants, and their mothers would make them pants the best way they could. And my heavens, we made our own quilts and our own comforts and everything. And, well, I'll tell you, my mother would, when you bought feed for the cattle, they got so they'd print feed sacks, you know, a material that they had pretty prints on feed sacks. Just like if you'd take a piece of pretty material and put feed in it, you know, make a sack and put feed in it. That's what the companies did. And she'd make us dresses out of that, and she'd make curtains, and a plain one she'd make sheets out of. You really did with that, you know, and did the best you could, but you weren't the only one. Everyone was in the same boat. So you didn't feel deprived. You didn't know you were poor then, because everybody else was, you know. It was really interesting.
How old were you at the time?
At that time, I was in high school, and my dad had had a heart attack, and he worked what they called on WPA on the road, and he was really not even able to work, but he would go out because there were 6 of us at home then. And Mom wouldn't leave any of us quit school. We had to go to school, you know, to get our education. So he made $52.80 a month. That's what we lived on. But I'll tell you, you could really stretch it. And a lot of people would give you, everybody tried to help everybody. If they had a little extra, or if they grew out of their clothes, they'd give it to you. And my mother would make clothes over. Oh, when anybody give us a sack of clothes, that was a gold mine, you know. Boy, she'd cut and sew. We all learned to sew and do then, I'll tell you. We were thrilled to death if anybody gave you anything. And they did, everybody, and we did the same with everybody else. Like I say, in the country, everybody tried to help everybody else. But then, before the Depression, we moved up to the dairy farm up on the Mount Pleasant Scottdale Road. That's no longer there. It was a beautiful place. And Donald was 17 then, and I was about 9. And we furnished the hospital with milk and had a milk rat beside. But the people we bought them from was Hitchman's. And they had an old horse named Daisy and a wagon with a top on that they delivered their milk, you know. And Daisy knew the milk rat. She would go so far and wait for you to deliver the milk and bring it back out, come back out with the empty bottle. And then she'd go to the next task, you know, after we delivered the hospital milk. But then my dad bought a Model A Ford. That was a brand new car. And he took the back seat out, and we used to deliver the milk with that. But anyway, we had 18 cows, milk cows. And I'd get up 4 o'clock in the morning and milk 6 cows. And he would milk cows, and Donald would milk cows. And then I'd have to help bottle the milk. And Jean would get the breakfast. And then I'd go on the milk rat with Pop and go to Mount Pleasant, you know, to help deliver the milk. And then he'd take me to school. And I went clear over to Aaron Bridge to school, and I'd have to walk home at night, at 4 o'clock. And that was about 1.5 miles or 2 miles. Then you washed the bottles, and you did your chores, and you milked 6 cows, and you fell in bed. That went on for years. And people wouldn't believe it if you'd tell them today. Well, parents would be taken in for child abuse, you know.
How old were you then when you started that?
I was 9. And then Donald got married, and of course Dad didn't have anybody to help him. We had over 100 acres. And I used to take 2 horses clear back to Bessemer's, far back there, and cut hay. And one time I ran into a bee's nest, and the horses ran off with me. And that's one of those old mowing machines. You know, it's a wonder I didn't get killed. But I hung on and got the horses settled. But that's just one of the experiences, you know, on the farm. I plowed with the tractor when I was about 10, you know, and would help Dad. The barn was a modern barn at that time. You'd take the hay and put it down into, they had it the way it was made. You could put the forks down in and they'd lift it, you know, it would lift. You had a horse to pull the rope. And you'd walk back into the door, the barn doors. But it was really interesting. But then later, 32
What was it?
A little sled. It was about 32 inches. Didn't have guiders on, just a plain little sled with runners. And my brother Donald always had he built himself a great big bobsled. And they would put me clear in the back. There'd be maybe behind the bobsled, there might be 10 or 12 sleds. And we'd go up to Crashers Hill. And they'd put me, I was about 5 at the time, clear in the back of all these sleds with my little wee sled. And I would be going back and forth. It's a wonder I didn't get killed. But we used to have a good time. To begin with, he had a steering wheel on his sled. He'd built it himself. Like I said, he was a real intelligent person, but he'd never go to high school. Had the steering wheel, and he'd set me between his knees, and he'd steer. And one time, boy, we had a wreck, and I flew right off of that into a big snowbank coming down the hill. It was funny. Then when we lived in Rustdale, I liked wagons, and I didn't care for doll babies. I wanted kittens and live things. So this one Christmas, my mother, I heard her saying, I'm going to get her a baby carriage, a doll carriage. And my dad said, now she wanted a wagon, and I got the doll carriage. Well, I got it in the morning, and I took it down the cellar, and it was Reed, a real good baby buggy. And I got the the hammer and the screwdriver, and I took the reed top off of the the wooden bottom all myself, and I put a piece of clothesline on it and made a wagon out of it. Oh, was my mother mad at me. My dad said, see, I told you she wanted a wagon. And we had a cow, and Hussers used to have a store, and they would buy milk from us, like a pint of milk a day, and we would deliver it every night. Well, Gina and I got to take the money and go to the store and buy candy then. But she'd take me, she was ashamed to take me in this buggy, their wagon I made, over time, so she'd take me down the streetcar track. I'd go bumpity bump, and she'd hide me in the bushes. It's gospel truth.
How old were you?
I was about 6 then. But anyway, she'd hide me in the bushes, and I had to stay there and wait on her till she brought the candy back. And if the streetcar come, I was scared to death, but I'd sit there and wait.
Sounds like the baby dolls.
Oh, well, that was when I was about 4. They got me a real good, the best dolls you could buy at the time was horseman dolls. And my dad was making good money, so of course they always bought us the best. I got this beautiful horseman doll. And I didn't want a doll. I wanted a teddy bear that year. And I didn't get my teddy bear, so I just took that doll and I cut it all up. And I buried it in the garden to get rid of it. And my mother said, I don't understand where that doll went. She hunted and hunted, and I said, I don't know. And when my dad spaded the garden up the next year, he found it. And believe me, Mom wasn't too happy about it. Then she used to make pies and other things that I used to do. She made pies, a lot of apple pies and things like that. And she said, we had an old cow named Daisy, and she was a real pet. But anyway, she said, Doris, take these apple peelings out and give them to Daisy. Daisy liked apple peelings. Well, Daisy was laying down. And I thought, gee, I'll get in her back and give her a ride. So I got on her back, and Daisy got up real fast and started running down the hill, and I flew off in a hurry. I'll tell you, I came up the house crying. She said, what happened to you? I said, Daisy threw me off her back. Oh, I used to get in all kinds of trouble. But anyway, I wanted to tell you, when I went to high school, I took agriculture, because you had bookkeeping, you had everything in agriculture, then. Because you went a half a day for agriculture. And we had a wonderful man named Mr. Sleppy. And he really was into it, So I had 100 baby peeps. And I had a little brooder about this big, coal brooder, and a shield over it. And that's how I raised those peepees. Well, you had to keep this little wee stove going, I was, I think, a junior in high school at the time. And I had to get up every hour or so at night to keep that heat going. In the daytime, my dad kept it going when I was at school. And I had 100 white leghorn pullets. And I only lost 2 of them, 2 peepees. And when I'd go in with my buckets to feed them, they'd jump on my buckets and jump on my shoulders as they grew up. They were real tame. Well, then in the spring, I put an acre of strawberries out. And I'd sell the strawberries. Well, Mr. Sleppy wanted me to put them into the States, what word, I can't think of the word I want. Enter them into the state, for the state, the whole extension service, yes. It was high schools, all high schools in the state could enter if they wanted
competition.
to. Yes. So he insisted that I do it because he knew I worked hard at it, And I bought 3 different varieties, and I planted them, and oh, how I worked on those. Well, the first year I entered, the state men would come around and inspect your books and inspect your berries, see if you kept them clean, there's no weeds, and an acre of strawberries is a lot of strawberries to put out, when you have to do it all by hand anyway. And I also had about an acre of potatoes out. And, well, it was 100 pounds, really. The seed potatoes was 100 pounds. But I got 25 bushel off of the 100 pound of potatoes. That was a real good yield.
Hmm.
And the strawberries, we'd get up early in the morning and go out and pick, you know. Then we'd take them to Scottsdale and sell them. And the berries were huge. And I would sell 4 quarts for a quarter. This was during the Depression. And I never had any trouble selling them. And that's what I helped the family to live on, you know, with my strawberries and my eggs from my chickens. And I'd take the eggs down to Hazard's store on the school bus and exchange them for groceries, you know, or get, I think eggs then were about 10 cents a dozen. You know, that's about what you paid for them. So, but it was interesting. I'll tell you, you learned a lot. You learned how to keep books. You learned how to take care of your responsibilities of taking care of your things, and it made it real nice.
Tell them how you made out with your strawberries with the competition.
Well, the competition, I placed 3rd in the state of Pennsylvania the first year, and the very last year I placed 1st, and that was, they took me to Harrisburg, to the farm show, which was a big thing. And,
is it the state fair? Or?
Yeah, oh, it's 11, then it was 11 acres all under one roof. They still have the farm show in Harrisburg every January. And I also was in a play at the farm show when I was down there. That was an honor, too, you know.
What were you? What was the play?
Oh, honest to forget the name of it. It was something pertaining to farms, you know. But that was a big thing for me. I really enjoyed it. But we had a wonderful life on the farm. It was hard work, but it was a wonderful life.
Tell them about what happened to the chickens, though.
Oh, when we moved
during the Depression.
Yeah. Here my mother raised, this was later, she raised white rocks, they were called, big heavy chickens, you know, for roasting. And we must have had a good 100. They were beauties. My heavens, we went away one day, and when we come home, there's dead chickens laying everywhere. Somebody came in with hunting bird dogs, and they just killed most of those chickens off. She was just heartsick. This was later on, a few years later. This was after we moved up to the farm, the dairy farm. But that was a real heartbreaking thing to see all those beautiful chickens laying around dead, you know. But
So
then,
you said you went to a one-room schoolhouse?
oh yes, at Rankin School, And I think I was there in 2nd grade. And they took you from, she had all 8 grades, you know. Well, then I was at two different one-room schools. Then when we moved up to the dairy farm, the school was behind our barn, and it was a one-room school. And one cold winter night, the school burned down. We found out later who burnt the school down. One of the big boys that didn't want, he was real tall and big, and he didn't want to go to school anymore, and he burnt the school down. Nobody ever knew it till years later. He told it. But that's when you, in a one-room school, you had one stove, and when you went, you put your mittens, and they had an awful odor to them, the boots and the mittens around the stove to dry them out. And you had one water bucket and one dipper, and everybody drank out of the same dipper and same water bucket. They'd go out and knock the ice off of the pump so they could pump, the boys would do that. And then the boys was honored if they got to clap the racers together to clean the racers, you know, off. That was a big thing, too. But, it was really a wonderful life, I'll tell you. And at home...
So was that the first 8 grades that you were in the one-room school?
No, not 8th grades. I was only in those about 4 years. And then after the school burned, I had to go to Aaron Bridge. That's when I was milking 6 cows every morning.
And you were taking a bus?
No, that was later on in high school. We took the bus. That
So how
was
did you get to
years
school?
later. My dad would take me in the morning, otherwise I'd have to walk. But I'd be late if he didn't take me, you know. He'd drop me off. From the milk route, I'd go straight to school. And then later on in 7th and 8th grade, I had to take the streetcar to Scottsdale and change streetcars and go up to Alfred. And then that was a job, too, trying to get to school. But, boy, we were...
How far was it?
Oh, my, that was miles. That was clear on the other side of the township. But my mother, boy, you weren't allowed to miss school. You had to go to school. Made no difference, you know.
Can you tell me about when your family got a radio?
That was when Amos and Andy was on, and Gildersleeve and all those things. We had, that was
How old would you have been?
Oh, let's see. About 14, I imagine. 12 or 14 around there. And we had a radio in the dining room. And the fair, we always kept a fair in the fireplace. And we'd have a big bowl of apples. And everybody would sit around while we listened to the radio in the evening, you know. And we'd be real quiet. And boy, everybody listened. That was wonderful. And to hear all those, you know, and see all those things, it was really great. So then, when I was in high schools, when I met Henry, we lived out on the farm then, and my dad built a little stand to sell vegetables and things, you know. And we had candy, and my mother made root beer, and people loved her root beer. They'd come and buy it with a gallon. We sold root beer and vegetables and cigarettes and candy and things at this little stand. And we had a tennis court then, too. And, of course, the kids would come out from town to play tennis. And my dad always had a couple of big hay stacks because we couldn't get it all in the barn. And those boys from town loved to slide down those haystacks. And my dad used to get so mad at us for it. But we couldn't stop him, you know. But anyway.
Why? Because it spread the hay out?
Mm-hmm. And we weren't allowed to go out. My mother wouldn't go. There were 5 of us girls. We weren't allowed to date. But they could come to our house, you know, everybody from town. So that was this idea of the tennis court. They could come and play tennis. Well, they did. They came. Everybody loved to come to our house, you know. And they'd come and play tennis. And all of a sudden, one time, Henry had a date with a girlfriend, Dorothy Weaver. And she came, and she introduced me to her. I was in the stand selling, you know. And the next night, Henry come, and I said, Dorothy isn't here. He said, I didn't come to see Dorothy, I come to see you. And I said, not me. I was shocked to death. I said, I'm not allowed to have a boyfriend. He said, well, that's all right, I just come to see you. And he kept coming, and of course, we weren't allowed to go out at all, Gene and I. My mother was very strict.
How old were you?
I was about 15 then. I was too young to have a boyfriend, you know. But I wasn't allowed to go out with him for about 3 years, maybe 4. But then I was allowed
After you were out of high school?
A year before I was out of high school. We were going to the same church together. We always, you know. Then we went to Zion Church in the afternoon. The Reforms went one Sunday, and the next Sunday the Lutherans had it. And my mother's people, the Lichties, gave the ground for the church in the cemetery. And they built a log church. Well, later on then they built the church they have now. And they no longer have church there. But my cousin is restoring the church. He's put about $40,000 in it so far. And he's restoring the church himself now.
That's
it's a reform.
My great-uncle Jim.
No, that's another relative. That would be, well, I have to think about that. But anyway, before I forget, they had 2 big pot-bellied stoves in the church, you know, to heat it.
Mm-hmm.
And they had beautiful lights, and they had the pine pews. And the women sat on one side of the church and the men on the other. You never sat together. The children, of course, had Sunday school. And when we were home, now this was when I was younger, out at the other farm, we would go to church every Sunday afternoon. And we had an old dog, part Shep and part collie, part shepherd and part collie. And he was always going to follow the car when we went to church. And he would come in the church and lay down under the back pew. He never made any problems at all. And everybody accepted it, you know. He'd wait and then he'd follow us home again. And when my dad died, the body was at the house, you know, and we had to keep Shep in the barn. Well, here somehow he got out of the barn, and the next Sunday when we went to church, he followed us to church, and he came into the church, went up to the front of the church. And there's a railing around the part of the church, you know, in the front, where they put the casket before they buried. You know, they had the sermon in the church. First he went up the steps to the pulpit, and my mother had to get the broom and chase him out of the church. So when we come out of the church, there he was laying on top of my dad's grave. That was so interesting to know that how he knew that, you know. When we go out to Zion, I'll show you the grave. But anyway, it's one of those things that you think couldn't happen, but it did. And then getting back to Henry then, I was telling you about the tennis court. About the next year, all these people stopped coming, the young people from church, mostly boys, you know. And I said, gee, I can't understand. And he didn't say anything. But he told somebody that told me later he warned those boys not to come there anymore.
Was Henry big for his age at that time?
Yeah, he was 3 years older than me. But anyway, my mother and dad liked Henry. He came from a big family, you know. And of course, Lentz family was well known. They were a good family too, good Christian people. But the first time I was allowed to go with him was up to the Sunday school picnic, up at camp, you know, up at Maple Grove, the park up above where we have the cabin.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother on Sundays once in a while would pack us a lunch, you know, sandwiches and things, and we'd go up and skate, and swim and then skate and then dance a little in the evening. But
roller skate?
Yeah, uh-huh. Sure, at the roller skating rink. Uh-huh. We'd swim and roller skate. We'd have lunch, and of course all the friends would come because they knew I had good food in my basket from church, you know. And that's how I learned about Maple Grove. That's why we got a cottage up there. But, yes, it was a nice life, I'll tell you.
So how long did you go on dating like that, going to Maple Grove?
Well, we didn't get married till 5 years after. It was a depression, you know. The war was on, and I didn't know if Henry was going to have to go. He didn't know either, but all his brothers went. There were, how many? Out of the 6, I think 4 went to the service. One was an airplane pilot, Chuck. He was a pilot, and then he put people in the instructor. He was an instructor too, you know. And then Harry was in the service. He was in the Navy, and R.C. was in the Army.
Was it Sheddington?
No, Chet. And see, they had the foundry, and they were doing work for the war effort from Denor. And Henry.
What did they make at the foundry during the war?
Oh, they made all those things. I was showing you the big pieces. They made a lot of things for the war effort. From down along the river, you know, Denor Works.
No, I don't
They
know.
took, oh my, how much. They would work half the night. We were married in 1940, and Henry worked day and night, you know. But he went also to Carnegie Tech at night, 3 nights a week.
Where was
for
that?
years.
Carnegie Mellon.
Carnegie Mellon, in Pittsburgh, you know, to a college, 3 nights a week. And he and a couple other fellows would go in. But he took up foundry work and pattern making and an awful lot. But he was a great help to his dad, too. All the boys
What did he study at Carnegie Mellon?
Engineering.
Yeah, he did foundry work, all kinds of pattern making. See, Grandpa had a pattern shop. And that's how he did. I don't know what all he studied. I forget to tell you.
Engineering, drafting.
Drafting and everything like that.
But why did he have to stop going to school?
Well, he stopped after he graduated, you know.
Because he couldn't get tires.
Oh, yes. I had trouble getting
With the
gasoline and everything.
The rationing.
And then it got so bad that he was working all the time then, too. They didn't have enough.
Oh,
Grandpap was afraid
because of rationing during the war, he couldn't
Oh,
get
yes.
tires for the car to drive into
They
Pittsburgh.
rationed sugar and flour and everything, yes. Uh-huh. And they had, it was rough during the war, you know, for people. But then...
How did that compare to during the Depression?
Oh, the Depression was worse. I mean, they had places you could go to get sugar and flour and things, you know. It was really bad. A lot of people it was harder than others for, you know. But anyway, then we were married, and we had a wedding, a garden wedding at home. And my mother put, it was in the afternoon, and she put big tables up in the tennis court.
What was the date?
August the 21st, 1940. And I was 23 and Henry was 26. And she made my wedding gown, and everything cost me $10. There's a picture of it. And so anyway, my cousin did the flowers for we had 5 bridesmaids, and my dad built an altar and fixed the chairs like a church and put colored leaves with chickenware around it, just like a beautiful altar, you know. He had it all fixed up. And oh, there were more than 200 people there, all outside. It was a beautiful day. And I wanted to be married out when the birds were singing and everything, and I was. We had a wonderful wedding. And
how many people came?
oh, there was way over 200. The cars were on both sides of the road, up and down as far as you could see, and the chairs were all filled. 2 days before the wedding, Mom killed chickens, and we pressed them and made sandwiches, you know. And she took watermelons and hauled them out and put punch in there on the tables. She had always good ideas. And, oh, I don't remember what all she served, but a whole lot of stuff.
What are pressed chickens?
Pressed chicken, she'd press it to make it more palatable, you know. And she'd
so you
slice it.
Cut the meat off the bones.
Yes, but she'd cook it first and press it, you know. It brought the flavor of the chicken out real good. But, oh, she served, and she had a wedding cake for me and everything, you know. All the potato salad and the usual things. But the neighbors all come and helped get the wedding ready, you know, and the food ready for the wedding. We always had a good time because we had good neighbors. In the country, it's different, you know. And then Grandpap Lentz, not to be outdone, he had expected, we had to have a big affair too. He's one that wanted to put on a nice affair too. So in the evening then, we all had to go in there. Well, Henry was just joined the fire department at 18, but he was in for several years, you know. So my Lord, they put us on the fire truck.
Pleasant Fire Department?
When you got married, they put you up on the fire truck and had a big parade. They took you all over town and all around, and I was so embarrassed I could have died.
The lights and siren going?
Yeah, oh, definitely. The siren went as loud as possible, and everybody would join in cars behind you till you had a real parade going. Everybody was honking the horns, you know. And what a time. Well, they had music over to Grandpap's on the 3-car garage. They served in there, and they had a band.
At the fire department?
Yeah, well, the Grandpap had it, but all the fire department was there, plus all their friends, you know. And it was quite an affair, I'll tell you. Well, then, about 12 o'clock, Grandma said, now it's time that they get going on their honeymoon, Grandma Lentz. So if it hadn't been for her, we'd have probably been there all night. And we went to Niagara Falls on our honeymoon. We had $25, and that was a lot of money. So we went to Niagara Falls, over on the Canadian side, and we went to the honeymoon hotel, and it was $2 a night. And in the morning, we went out and got our breakfast, and it was 29 cents. I'll never forget it. We had...
was that a lot?
A lot. Now, wait till I tell you.
Mm-hmm.
We had 2 eggs. We had toast. We had a dish of prunes. We had coffee. You had a dish of pancakes. You had pancakes. And all this, I forget what all, but it was an awful big breakfast for 29 cents a piece. And when we come home, we had $10 left. That included the gas. Then the gas was like 19 cents, and 15 to 19 cents a gallon. And he had a little, well, first of all, Henry had a little old car that he thought was great. Well, Grandpa was a little bit embarrassed by it, so he bought him a new car.
Do you remember what the car was?
It was an old Chevy. I think I have a picture somewhere. I must look. But anyway, oh, Henry kept that polished up, and it was put white sheets on the cover, on the back of the seats, you know, and all. He was so proud of it. Well, Grandpa was a little bit embarrassed because he had a Packard, great big Packard with the 2 extra seats, you know, and he had a Chrysler.
What was Grandpa's name?
Roy Lentz. And he's the one that had the foundry the second time. His father started after the Civil War, you see. But anyway, Grandpa was a little embarrassed that one of his kids had a car that bad, so he bought him a new one.
After you had been married?
No, this was before we were married. He bought it.
Oh, okay.
Chevy, and so that's when we went to Niagara Falls then.
Could you see the falls from the motel room?
From the Canadian side was beautiful. Yes, Honeymoon Hotel was a brand new one. My beautiful place. We went back every year. He'd always take me in August up until he died. Every August we'd go to Niagara
Really?
Falls.
Every year you were
yes,
married?
Except when I was pregnant with her. We always went to Niagara Falls for a week-long vacation. We'd take the kids, too. You know.
For your anniversary?
We took the trailer and the kids later on then with us. They always enjoyed going. But it was really nice. We had a good life together. We were always taught you should own your own home. So I said to Henry, I'd like to have my own home before I'm married, and I gathered things up. I was working at the hospital at the time, on the trays and in the food kitchen, you know, help. I made $1 a day, and I'd work from early morning till late at night. So after I saved all my money up, and I had enough money to buy paper. Well, Henry, I'm ahead of my story. Henry bought this little house, 3-roomed house here on Center Avenue, paid $1,000 for it, and we were paying $15 a month on that. He only made, I think it was around $14 a week, and we were paying on our house, and we bought a little bit of furniture, but we had a lot given to us. And my dad bought us, had a new table and chairs handmade, and Grandpa Lentz bought us a new stove. I got to pick it out, a gas stove, and I bought a second-handed refrigerator and a second-handed washer, and I bought the paper and the paint for the house. And my dad was real sick. He had a bad heart, but he came in and painted. My brother Donald came in and papered, and we got the house, the 3 rooms all cleaned up. There wasn't even a heater in at the time. So Henry bought a second-handed heater from a man in Scottsdale for $10. And one of the men at the foundry came over and helped him put the heater in.
Coal heater?
An old coal heater that smoked like the dickens. But anyway, we got that all tended to, and oh, we thought we were millionaires, I'll tell you. We were so happy. And we had an awful lot of wedding gifts, linens and things given to us. But I had been saving up all those years, making things and doing things for my home. And we were just as happy as 2 lovebirds, I'll tell you. Well, we didn't even we had a toilet on the backyard. So the first thing we did, Henry had to dig clear down to the creek under the streetcar track to put a bath or a commode in the basement. Well, when we got that commode in the basement, we thought we were something. But anyway, then Henry Jr. was born 3 years.
So it flushed into the creek?
Well, I don't know. I guess it would eventually. Now it don't, you know. They put a sewer down through, but then it did. But anyway, Henry Jr. was born 3 years later, and we had still the 3 rooms and a back porch, and you had to get on the back steps to get to the cellar to fix the heater up and to go to the commode down there. Well, we had a shower in then too. Henry put a big shower. The one that's there originally, yeah, it takes 2 6-foot shower curtains to go around it. It was a real big one. But anyway, when Henry was about 3, didn't he go down? We were sitting on the porch swing, both Henry and I, and he was riding his tricycle. And he was a little rascal. You couldn't trust him for a minute. My Lord, we looked, and here he was riding his tricycle down the steps. I thought he'd kill himself. But it didn't bother him. He cried a little, but I was scared to death, and so was Henry. But the streetcar used to go up and down every 15 minutes. And Henry Jr. was the type that you had to keep in mind. Every second you had to watch him. So I had an awful time with him. But anyway, finally one day I was up at the NP store on Main Street, and I had him by the hand, and he broke away from me and ran right across the street. He could have been killed. So I went up and bought you could buy a little harness then. I bought him a harness, and I put a line to it. And when I went anywhere, I took him in the harness. Well, there for a while, I had put a little bit of chicken wire out around the front porch to keep him in so he wouldn't run out. Even if he had to come in for a drink of water, he'd go. And he was a kid you couldn't keep down. He had to be on the go all the time. So I tied him to the porch post with a clothesline and the harness when I had to do anything inside. And one of Mrs. Fox at the street came back. She said, "You're treating that child like a dog." She had about 9 children, and then the farther out the street, she lived on the end, and the street then wasn't even paved. Her kids would be out playing in the dirt all the time, and the cars would have to go around them. And I said, "Well, at least my child's safe." Well, then, one time I had a garden down in the Willows. I had to go across the streetcar track, but before that, though, I'm ahead of my story. Henry Jr., like I said, he had to keep him in, or he loved to be out. He'd run off for me. I caught him twice on the streetcar track. You couldn't trust him a minute. So one time, Henry went to an Elks convention, and I had saved my pennies up till I had enough to buy a 6-foot roll of chicken wire. And I wanted Henry to put a fence up in the back, and he said no. We were filling the yard in then, you know. It was kind of down, and he was bringing the stuff from the Cublo in to fill it up, you know, to fill the yard in to make it level. So he had about 1/4 of it done, or 1/2 of it maybe. So Henry went to the convention, and I had enough money to buy a roll of chicken wire, and I called my brother Jim. And I said, "Jim, would you come in and put a fence up, because I can't wash clothes with him. I'm afraid he'll get down on the streetcar track." So he said, "Sure." So he and Mr. DeMore, the neighbor, put the 6-foot chicken wire fence up.
6 foot high?
6 foot high, and put stakes in, you know. And he couldn't get his feet in because it wasn't quite big enough, or I didn't think it was. Well, when Henry came home from the Elks convention, he was furious at me. He said, "You're treating him like a chicken." I said, "Well, it's better to have him like a chicken and have him safe." And he was furious at me. But anyway.
How long did the fence last?
Well, a few years. But anyway, he had this, we bought him one year. You couldn't buy toys during the war, but we saw a tractor for sale. And we went to Greensburg. And it was a great big thing, about that high and this wide.
How big?
Oh, it must have been 3 feet high and about 4 feet long. And you pedaled it, you know.
Uh-huh.
And Henry had it all painted up and fixed up, and he dearly loved that tractor. So anyway, he took it down. We had it in the backyard one day, and I could see him. If I'd happened to go across to get a head of cabbage, I'd run down quick and come back up, you know. And I knew we had to put in a gate with a lock on, with a padlock on the gate so he couldn't open it. And I knew he was all right. Well, I heard these neighbors up here hollering and laughing. And I looked down, there was Henry. He's about 3, stark naked, standing on top of the tractor trying to crawl out over the fence. And I wasn't gone 5 minutes till I could see him, you know, from where I was. Why did I get up here in a hurry and get him? But he surely loved his tractor as he grew up. Even there's 3.5 years between him and Jim. And he used to ride it back and forth on the sidewalk, you know. And then Jim had it. And then Henry fixed a place on the tractor that he could put a little wagon behind it to haul Jim. And he just loved that. But, oh, that Henry was something else. One time, I think I told you this story. It was 2 weeks before Jim was born, and I was awful heavy. Oh, just couldn't hardly make it. And I called, just went in for a minute, back out, Henry was gone. Called all the neighbors. Nobody saw Henry. Then the neighbors was sitting in their porches, you know, and they'd tell you if they saw him. So I called the foundry, and they just finished pouring air. And I was crying, and Grandpap answered, and he said, Doris, what's wrong? He thought I was about to be delivered anyway, you know. And I said, I can't find Henry, Grandpap, and I'm afraid something happened to him. He said, never mind, Doris. We're done pouring air. We'll all get in our cars and go hunt him. And I said, he's been gone a good while. I can't find him. I've called all the neighbors. He said, never mind, don't worry, we'll get him. Well, it wasn't too long till Grandpap found him. He had gone down, him and Flossie, the little Pomeranian dog, had gone down to the end of the street at a restaurant, and they found him up on Bunker Hill going to the cabin. He said he was eating an ice cream cone and had the dog. They were going to the cabin. Now, he knew the way to the cabin at that age, 3.5. And
how far is it to the cabin?
Oh, my Lord, it's about 20 miles.
Okay.
But anyway, I couldn't even smack him when he came home. I was so glad to see him.
Where did he get the ice cream?
And that's what Grandpap asked him where he got the ice cream. He said he got up on a stool and a man bought him the ice cream. Got him the ice cream, and then he and the dog were going to the cabin. And he was eating the ice cream cone going up over Bunker Hill to the cabin. My Lord, I said, I hope you have a son or a grandson someday that puts you through what you put me through. He was something, that child. There was a man killed down here. The streetcar went every 15 minutes. And there's a man killed right below our garage. We had an old garage down there at the time. And it scared me to death. But twice I found him on the tracks. That's why I put the 6-foot chicken wire fence up against Henry's wishes when he's gone. Well, then he saw what the problem was, Henry did. And later on, then we put a decent fence up. But that fence lasted a couple of years. But he used to, Grandpap, you couldn't buy toys then, like I said. So he bought him a little wooden wagon, and he'd buy things for the kids because he thought an awful lot of Henry. Anyway, he'd come over, usually Monday morning when I was washing, and to see the boys, you know, when he'd go to the post office. But he'd say, now you go up and buy this and that for Henry, or he saw something pretty, you get this or that for Jim. And he'd say, now, what do they want in the catalog? And he'd tell me to get it. And he said, but don't tell Visa. But it tickled me. He always tried to see that. And every Christmas, he would come over the first thing in the morning to see the kids. And we always had the record players going, you know, and singing the Christmas songs and all. He loved that. But then when Patricia came along, Jim was born, and then Patricia, isn't there 5 years between you and Patricia? Uh-huh. And the boys took care of Patricia. Well, they had her spoiled rotten. She'd say, nobody loves me, I'm going to run away. Then get her and they'd have sticks of chewing gum or something in their pocket when they come home from school to give her, you know. They had her spoiled terrible. But when she was first born, they took her picture around to all the neighbors, and it's all finger marked, her new baby picture that they give you in the hospital. They knocked on the door, and they're surprised that they had a little sister. They took it to all the neighbors. They told me later, you know, and here's all these little finger marks around showing off their little sister. It was real cute. But
do you want to talk about the cabin?
Well, yeah, we went
on the creek.
Well, I'll tell you about Henry's family a little bit. They had, Grandpap and Grandma had 15 children, and when you went there, you always felt welcome. He always wanted everybody to come and eat. And poor Grandma had all these kids, but she always had a hired girl to help her. And the kids had to do the dishes and everything and clean up the table before they went back to school at dinner time. Everything had to be in order, and she did the cooking all. He would go out to the slaughterhouse in the morning when he would go to the post office and get the meat and everything. He'd get like a whole backbone of from the pig, you know, and he'd bring it in and throw it down on that dough tray in the dining room there, and he'd say, "Now, Vice, I want these fried for lunch." I've been there when I heard he loved pork chops fried with potatoes, you know. And their dining room, they just had one big long table, that corner cupboard, and chairs and benches for the table. Big long wall for 15, you know, and then you never knew how many others because the kids would bring kids home to eat, you know, from school. And there's a couple little boys that Grandpap liked that came in from the foundry. One little boy, his grandmother was raising him, and he'd been Sammy Gagnetti, the one that is well off today. And he said he'd never forget. Grandpap always, he'd send him up to get shoes, you know, at the store and clothes. But everybody was welcome at the dinner table with Grandpaps. He always saw that he wanted everybody there. And he'd send the kids, Simons and Saloons. The old merchants were there. And Grandma never could go hunt clothes. He'd say, "Now, you go ahead up." He'd say, "Go up and get your shoes and put them on credit." Well, then the first of every month he'd pay. And I'll tell you, when you have 15 kids buying shoes, and some of the neighbors along with them, and then during the Depression, I told you before, he would fill up the truck and send his sisters out at Norvelt. They lived down in that area. And he'd send things out with a truckload, food and clothes, to them. And they'd come in, he'd send them up to buy things, because the foundry always made pretty good money, you know. But they had it hard. I mean, they worked hard, but they had the money to buy with. And he was awful good to them, I'll tell you. He never paid his boys very much. He didn't believe in spoiling them. But he was a good man. And every Sunday morning, it didn't matter, even up until Henry was married, and Henry and I were married, there's always 2 pews in the back of the church full of Lentzes. Every kid had to come to church dressed up. And he and Grandma would come too, you know, everybody come together. And it was that way on Grandma Lichty's side too. Everybody and all our relatives in the past, even Grandpapa and all of them, they were always real good church members. But it's interesting to see. They always paid in good to the church and were well known, you know, for being good people. Then when Henry and I were married about a year, he had a life insurance policy, $1,000 to come due, that he had paid from the time he was young, you know. And that was a fortune to us. So anyway, we went up to, I forget their names, below the park they lived, up at the cabin, you know, up at Maple Grove. And Berkey was his name. And Henry said, "Is there any place up here we could get a little bit of ground?" Henry Jr. wasn't born yet. It was about a year after we were married. He said, "Along the creek here, it's so pretty, I'd like to have a place." He said, "I always promised Doris she wouldn't have to live in town. Someday I'd get her a place, you know." So Berkey said, "Yes, there's a school teacher bought her dad a piece of property down here, and he died, and she wants to sell it." So Henry said, "Well, I'd like to see it." So he went down, he and Berkey, and here was this piece of ground, and you couldn't see from one end to the other. It was all crabapple trees, you know, and bush. And Henry said, "Do you like that, Doris?" I said, "Oh, I'd love to have that, Henry." He said, "Well, I'll tell you, we'll get out and get it." So Grandpap was mad about it because he thought that Henry wouldn't work, you know. He'd be up there cleaning and fixing, and he wouldn't work, so he was afraid to tell his dad at first. So we bought the ground. $300 we paid, 30 cents a foot. No, it was more than that. Well, it was $300 is what we paid, and that was a fortune to us, you know. So then Henry wanted to buy me a red fox coat and hat to match. And I said, "No, Well, he even took me up to Punxsutawney to the furrier to get it. And I said, "Oh, Henry, I don't know." And the man said, "Well, he's coming to Pittsburgh the next day, and he'd have more, and he'd show it to me." And I said, "Oh, Henry, coming home, I don't want that." I said, "Let's put that money towards building a little place in heaven in the mountain." And he said, "Oh, I don't know, I always promised you." And I said, "I don't want it." I said, everybody would enjoy it, you know. So he said, "Okay." So we went up to Cranbrook's one time. You couldn't buy wood anywhere. This was during the war. And Harold Cranbrook, a good friend of ours, said, "I know a sawyer, Gilbert White, in the mountain that has a sawmill. And he has one of the best sawyers in the mountain. Let you and I go see him, Henry." So you know how the mountain people are real loyal to each other and close-knit. And Gilbert said, "Well, I'll see that you get enough rough lumber to build 2 rooms and a porch. That's all I wanted." So he said, "All right." And Henry, of course, was delighted. Well, then we couldn't get enough for the flooring, but Harold said, "I know that they're tearing that old mill down up above Indian Creek there. It's on Indian Creek." And he said, "It's chestnut, wormy chestnut." So he said, "Come on, I'll take you up and we'll see if we can get you enough for the flooring." So we got wormy chestnut floors in the cabin and hardwood inch thick, not a 3/4 inch thick, but inch thick rough lumber. That's what that cabin built out of. The roof and the sides and everything. That's what we had: 2 12-by-12 rooms and an 8-by-24 porch put on. And we couldn't afford any more. We couldn't afford the screen. It was about chewed up with mosquitoes the first year. But we loved that cabin.
Oh, well, the sap was running off.
The sap was running out of the wood.
Because it wasn't kiln dried?
No, and you had to build it right away because it would warp, you know. So after the nails were in it, you couldn't get them out. And Henry would come down and I'd pick the stones up. I made the walks, stones on each side of the walks the way they are today. And then as the kids come along, of course, then we had to whitewash. They hated that by everything. We'd make it all pretty and white, you know, and Henry always was the one that would have to do the trees because he was the tallest. Jim said, "Yeah, but you don't have to bend over like I do. It hurts your back." And Henry said, "Yeah, but it hurts me." They fought like everything about whitewashing. I'd get them up real early in the morning, and I'd have the water good and hot, and we'd mix the lime, and then we'd put bluing in to starch to make it blue and stick, you know. But it was beautiful when it was done. The moonlight nights, you could see all through the trees, you know, the white on the trees and everything. And he got company if the people would.
Thanks.
If the people would move those stones. I think if you make somebody else happy, don't worry about yourself, and you'll be happy too then.
What's your words of wisdom?
That's about all I can think of at the moment. We have so much to be thankful for. The Lord's been good to us and our family, I'll tell you. And I'm proud of my whole family. Every one of them are good workers and good Christian people, good church members. And that's what we raised them for, to try to be good and to be nice to everybody. And I'm proud of them for all getting along. They all try to help each other, and they're all good people. And I know Henry would be happy to see them all doing so well. And those dear little grandchildren, we're so happy to have those great grandchildren, too. It's just wonderful to think that they're all in such good health and getting along so well. And I thank the Lord for it. The farmers and cooking stoves. And today there are a few bells left. There's only one that I know of. And if you remember, that's the one up at Lily Kaufman's brother's picnic area. I don't know if you ever rang it, but I know Marcy and
I remember
Ryan
that.
did.
Yeah.
Yes,
Was he was he in the foundry business in Germany before he came over?
No, his father was a tailor, and he came over from. When we went up the Rhine River to Holland, we passed. There's a town named Lentz, And that's where he came from. His father was a tailor in Germany in the town of Lentz. L-E-N-Z they call it. The T isn't in it. But that's where he was. And he sent him over here, and he came over to his sister's down at Everson. His sister lived there, down in Everson Bottoms, and that's where he came.
Where's Everson Bottoms?
Down on the other side of Scottsdale. And he came and was working in the fields, and they came along. Some of the people from the service, were joining the army, and they were playing the band and the drum and the fife, And he threw down his tools and went and joined them. And he went to Pittsburgh, and I forget the company now. It's all on that record.
Mm-hmm.
And joined and went from there on to the war, And he served one term from, you'll have to get that from the record.
Yeah, I can get all that.
And fought all the way down south and back up to Gettysburg. And he was wounded at, you'll get that in the record too. And they told him he was taken prisoner by Germans, the people that spoke German,
Mm-hmm.
They were going to kill him in the morning. And he said, I know what you're talking about. You're going to kill me in the morning, and I'm German too. And they said, well, we can't do that. If you're German, we'll let you go. But if you make it over the breastwork, you're all right. But he got shotgun over the breastwork.
Oh, okay.
But he lived,
Mm-hmm.
And then he fought at Gettysburg 3 days in the peach orchard. And I think he was wounded there too, but it'll tell you in the on the record, Henry knows on the record about it. He has the record. You can get that off. You ought to take a picture of the record and get it all off of there. Well, then he came to Mount Pleasant and built a foundry over here.
Even though he had no experience with one before?
Oh, no, he had the foundry at Donegal before. Uh-huh.
Oh, I didn't catch that part.
And he came over here and had the foundry here. And
I thought that he was working in a farm.
Well, he came over here from Germany when he first came over. But then I don't know if he worked for somebody in the foundry. I'm not sure about that. But he built a foundry of his own. And the Cublo he built out of an old, what was it, Henry? Boiler. And that's where they used for years and years, didn't they?
Yeah, that's the only thing they used for a Cublo.
And nobody could understand how
even
they
at the one here in Mount Pleasant?
Yes, uh-huh.
Okay.
Up until the end. Your dad can tell you more about that than I could. But nobody in the foundry business could understand how they could melt iron and get it clean, could they, Henry? I don't know how they did it, but they had a special way of doing it. And it was quite unusual, wasn't it?
Yep.
But
Was this a Lentz family secret?
just good common sense, I guess. Isn't that the way it was?
Yeah.
Anyway, they made an awful lot of money out of that Cublo, didn't they?
Supported quite a few families for a lot of years.
I'll say an awful lot. But anyway, that was the story of it. And here's this is Grandpa Roy Lentz here. He always had a cigar in his mouth. I never saw him that he didn't. It's a wonder he didn't die of cancer, but he didn't. He died of a heart attack in his late 70s. And he's holding the chain that they move the castings with, And this is Henry. This is your grandpa here. He's clearing a piece of one of the molds that go over to Denora. They made a lot of those castings, That's a good picture of him. All right, is it okay to move it?
Mm-hmm.
And here's Chet. And we're working with the castings, too.
Which one?
That's Henry's oldest brother.
Which one's Chet?
This one's Chet, right here. And this is Grandpap, another picture of Grandpap.
Which Grandpap?
Roy Lentz. The Grandpap that I showed you before that had the scar in his mouth.
My dad's Grandpap.
Uh-huh. There you are. And they had that foundry for many, many, many years. And then Jim built a new one after Henry died, Was in the foundry for several generations since the Civil War. And I gave Jim 22 acres down here, and he built a new foundry then. And he's in business to do with it. So it's quite a long story, more than I can tell you in a few minutes.
Who? Ambrose Brown?
Ambrose would be my dad's brother, was in the Civil War. He's the one that married the Kate Lachlan I told you about when she was 16. And they had 2 children. And then Jenny Green and Benjamin Brown was his son and would be his son and daughter-in-law. And their children were Jess, Frank, my dad was Leisure, and Sister May. They were farmers, all these people. And Benjamin worked in the mine. He was a farmer too, but he worked in the mine. And they went down to church. They went to, I can't think of the name, Tyrone, the church I was telling you about. It's still going today. It's a Presbyterian church. And this is the one my brother Jim bought the old school. It was the last one-room school in Fayette County. And he bought it and was restoring it. Did a beautiful job restoring it. Well, then he got sick and he gave it to the church. And they're having Sunday school now. Now, they were going to build on. I have a picture of the church. I should give you that. It's in the other room. But anyway, the church was, when I was a little girl, my dad used to take me there when we'd come from Grandpa Brown's. And I always got thirsty, so he'd stop and get me a drink out of the spring. They always had an old dipper there, and we'd take a drink out of the dipper, you know. And the church is, it's way over 100 years old. But this year they kept one of the great big oak trees down, and they made a cross out of the one oak tree, one of the men did, and they hollowed it out and put a light behind it. It's beautiful. It's in the church. I'll have to take you down sometime and show it to you. Well, then there's an old cemetery there, and the school is over from the cemetery that Jim gave to the school, and they have their Sunday school in there for the children now. They didn't want to build on it if they could help it because they didn't want to ruin the architecture of the church, you know. So they were thrilled to death to get it. So this is...
So Leisure married...
Marie Louise Liechty. And then from there is my brother Donald is dead. He was the oldest one. Then Jean is a paraplegic, and myself and Betty was the nurse, and May married Eddie Gunner. And Jim is the one in Arizona, and Fern died when she was about 55. Then my grandmother was...
Do you want to tell me about the Liechties then?
Yes, Now, where do we get to them here? John and Alice were...
Well, there's Joanna and Jacob.
Well, that's the mother of John and father, you know.
Okay.
Then there was Alice is here. Allison married John, and these are her children.
Catherine and John.
Well, this is their children up here, Catherine and John.
And they had another John.
Mm-hmm.
And that's who.
Right. This is their.
That's who she married.
That's right. Then this is my uncles and aunts right here. I had one aunt they're all dead now. But anyway, Alice was my grandmother, and I just loved her. We were real close.
And she was Alice Pletcher?
Yes, She was a Pletcher.
And her parents were Martha and...
That's right.
And what was his name?
Harcum.
Martha Harcum and Noah
Pletcher, right.
Okay.
And they gave the ground for the church the Liechties gave the ground for Zion Church. And first there was an old log church built in the cemetery. And my cousin has restored the church. He's put over $40,000 in it so far, and he's not finished yet. But he's restoring the church.
Which cousin?
My cousin Chester's son. I forget his name right now.
Okay.
But anyway, we don't have those boys' names.
Okay.
It isn't on here. He had 2 sons, and the one son, he has tool and die works up at Cranberry. And that's what he's doing. He started a couple other businesses too now. But he's restoring the church. So I'll take you out there the next time you come home and have time, to see
Okay.
it. And I can tell you more about it then as we go along. And then
So you want to tell me
I
about
told you about Grandma Lentz's father and brother were drowned going across the lake home one night because there's a storm, and they drowned coming home.
who were they?
That was
Who's the Lentzes up here?
Visa. Where's Visa? Oh, wait, here's Visa. This would be. Which is hers, Henry? This is her brothers, aren't they? Yes, this is her brothers. I'm not sure which one was Samuel, I think it was. Either him or Clyde. No, Clyde's the one that's living in it, or was living it when Henry got this. One of them, I forget
when they're
which.
black, I think they died.
Oh, well, that
So
must have been
Clyde
Clyde
had
that
died.
got her dad, and this boy was drowned then.
Okay.
And her mother, she was a Collins, before she married Grandpap Lentz. And they had 13 children, and they aren't shown on here. So this isn't quite up to date yet.
No.
So that'll have to be brought up sometime. But
Do you know anything about the Williams?
No, I don't. I don't know anything about them.
All right. Why don't you tell me more about the Lentzes then? I know that Henry J. You told me about him.
Yeah, he worked in the foundry, and Roy worked in the foundry.
So Roy took over the family business and kept it all his
Henry
life?
took over the family business after Grandpap died. But he bought
so what
his
did
two
Roy do?
brothers out. Well, they had an argument, and he and his dad didn't get along, so he left and went over to Walworth. And these Charles went to the service. He was a flyer, and then he taught people to fly. But I forget how many.
He was an
people.
instructor.
Instructor, right? And then there was Harry. Was in the he worked in the foundry, but he was in the Navy. He went to the Navy during the Second World War. And Mabel, the children, they were all of them educated. But Mildred was a school teacher, and she's retired now. R.C. was in the Army during the war, and he worked for the water company. He just retired not too long ago. And Mildred died. R.C. is living, but not Mildred. Mabel died. Mildred's living. Charlotte's living, but Harry, Charles, Virginia, Minnie, Henry, Roy, Mabel, and Emery are all dead. They've all died.
Okay. I was asking this Roy. He worked in the foundry, didn't he?
No, that's Uncle. That was Henry's dad. Yes, he owned the foundry. Yes, he owned the foundry. And then when he died, he willed it to Chester and Henry and Harry. They were the only three boys that worked in the foundry. Well, then things got tough, and Henry bought Chester and Harry out. So then that was my husband, Henry, that took the foundry over. Well, then after he did that, and Jim got old enough, Jim worked there. And then when he died, Jim took the foundry over. And that's the way it is today, So we'll wait and see what happens next.
Okay.
When you have a little more time, we'll go over the rest of it. I can tell you a lot more later, Lichty Hall, we lived then. And my mother and I went to the store. She was taking me to the store. I was little. I was only about 4 then. And she dressed me all up in this little fur coat my dad had bought me, and a hat and a muff and everything. And
this was during the Depression?
No, this was before the Depression.
Okay.
Years before. About, 20 years before.
What
Anyway.
year was it?
Oh, my, that was...
Well, when were you born?
I was born in 1917.
Okay,
That was
so it would have
about-
been in the early 20s.
Yeah, And we were going down Lichty Hall on the mud road to the store at Rustdale. And she had her fur coat on, and I had mine on. We were all dressed up, and she got old Maud into the sleigh, and we were going down this little hill, and boy, all of a sudden, we got out of this deep rut.
Well, didn't you have like hot bricks and a buffalo robe?
Yeah, we had bricks and a buffalo robe over. She put hot bricks to your feet to keep warm. And all of a sudden, the sleigh got out of the rut and tilted clear over, and I flew in a snowbank, and she flew out. And nobody said anything, though. She got me out, brushed me off, and got me out of the snowbank, brushed me off, and routed the sleigh, and got Maud straightened around.
So Maud didn't take off?
No, she stopped. She was a real smart horse. She stopped, and Mom put me back in the sleigh and put the bricks back in. We found those and went on to Rustdale to get our groceries. But we were always spiffy. It was a beautiful sleigh. And Maud had this lovely harness, and we were all dressed up in our fur coats. I'll tell you, it was really something.
Was that something out of the ordinary for you to do, or did you normally use the sleigh to get groceries?
We used the sleigh. My dad worked in the mill at that time, and
What
he had our
mill?
Model T Ford, you know.
What mill was that?
In Scottdale.
A lumber mill?
No, a steel mill. And he would take that and go in the morning, you know. And if we wanted to go, we'd use the sleigh anywhere, with the sleigh bells, too, by the way.
Okay.
It was nice. It was a lot of fun. I remember it real well, just like it was yesterday. It was really nice. We had a wonderful childhood, I'll tell you. We had to work hard, but it was worth it.
How long did your dad work in the steel mill?
He worked there, I imagine, about 20 years, but he farmed along with it, you know, most of the time.
Did he work there through the Depression, or
no?
He got laid off before that?
No, he had a heart attack before the Depression, and he was pretty old then, by that time, you know, because I was in high school then.
I see.
And so that was later on in life, you know.
When was your dad born?
Oh, goodness, I forget now, Scott. I'll have to check. 18, oh, I don't know. I'll have to look. I'm bad on dates.
That's okay.
I'm really bad on dates.
Okay.
But anyway, when we get together the next time, I can tell you a lot more about them.
Okay.